everybody, it's Ms. Fincham. We'll be continuing Unit 2 by covering Topic 1.6, which is the phosphorus cycle. Just like with the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, we will be talking about how phosphorus moves between sources and sinks, but we will also be making some comparisons between the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle as we go through the different steps of the phosphorus cycle. Our objective today is to be able to explain the sinks and reservoir interactions in the phosphorus cycle. And the skill we will practice is the one that we've been practicing for the last few videos, which is explaining relationships between characteristics of an environmental concept and a visual model setting. Just like in the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle is the movement of phosphorus-containing elements between sources and sinks. The two main reservoirs of phosphorus are rocks and phosphorus-containing sediments. If we look at the diagram here, we can see rocks that can be found in mountains or really in any ecosystem contain phosphorus in them, and also sediments at the bottoms of bodies of water or even sediments found in soil. An important point to know is that the phosphorus cycle is extremely slow when compared to the carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The first one is that the two main reservoirs of phosphorus, which again are rocks and sediments, release phosphorus very slowly. It's a process called weathering, where wind and rain break down the rock and relieve phosphorus in a form called phosphate. Phosphate then has to be washed away from the rock or the sediments and into either aquatic ecosystems or into soil on land. This process takes a long time. Another reason that this is such a slow process is there's no gas form of phosphorus on Earth. And so what that means is that phosphorus has to be moved in the solid form of phosphate, which has to be weathered from rocks and carried away by water. That's just a really slow process. When we compare that again to the nitrogen or carbon cycles, there are gas phases in both of those cycles, which move those cycles faster. Finally, an important point to understand is that because phosphorus cycles so slowly, it's often a limiting nutrient in ecosystems because it takes so long for the rocks to be weathered and for them to release their phosphorus, which is then carried by runoff into either bodies of water or the soil. And that's just a slow process, and organisms therefore have less access to phosphorus. Now all organisms need phosphorus because it's a key element in ATP, which is an energy source for every living thing in DNA, and for many animals, it's a source of strength for their bones and for the enamel in their teeth. There are both natural and synthetic sources of phosphorus. The major natural source of phosphorus is the weathering of phosphorus-containing rocks by the wind and the rain. The wind and the rain beat down on these rocks over time, breaking them into smaller bits, which results in the release of phosphate from these rocks. The phosphate then dissolves into the rainwater and it's washed either into aquatic ecosystems or into terrestrial ecosystems or into the soil in an area. You can see this here on the diagram if you look at the big green circle. Again, the phosphates are worn down from those rocks, and then the wind and the rain will carry them either into a body of water or into a terrestrial ecosystem. It's important to remember that this process is very slow because of that. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient for many different ecosystems, meaning plant growth is dependent on how much phosphorus is available in terms of synthetic or human-made sources of phosphorus. Humans mine phosphate-containing rocks out of the ground, and then they add phosphates to either synthetic fertilizers or other products like detergents and cleaners. We can see this diagram here. If we dig up rocks that contain phosphorus and take out the phosphorus and add phosphates to these products, such as fertilizers or detergents, this creates an issue because when we have runoff from agricultural fields, it can carry the phosphates that were in the soil into nearby bodies of water, and the same thing can happen if we're talking about detergents and cleaners because those can leave homes via their wastewater, and the phosphates in those detergents and cleaners can eventually enter natural bodies of water. Just like nitrogen, phosphate is absorbed from the soil by plants' roots, and it's assimilated into plant tissues. Animals, just like in the nitrogen cycle have to eat plants to take in phosphorus to their bodies or eat other animals that have eaten plants. Then we also have the excretion of animal waste or the decomposition of dead organic matter by soil bacteria and decomposers, and that's going to return phosphorus to the soil. Just like in the nitrogen cycle, we have this mini loop that is formed here when we have assimilation of phosphorus into plants. Then the animals eat those plants to take up the phosphorus into their body. When the animals and plants die, the phosphorus is returned to the soil by decomposition, just like in the nitrogen cycle. Next, we'll talk about sedimentation and geological uplift. Phosphorus does not dissolve super well into water, which means that much of it precipitates out or forms solid phosphate sediments at the bottom of a body of water. Think about when you make Kool-Aid and you add too much sugar. Is that even possible? The water can only hold so much of that sugar, so a lot of it forms crystallized sugar at the bottom that you can actually see. This is similar to the way that phosphate will precipitate out of a water source. We call this act sedimentation. The act of forming phosphate sediments settle to the bottom of a body of water over time. And what we can see is that the weight of the water above those phosphates containing sediments will compress those sediments into sedimentary rock. With limestone or sandstone geological uplift, then, is the process where tectonic plates collide and force new rock layers up to form mountains. And this allows new rock to be exposed to elements like wind and rain, which then starts the weathering of phosphorus. We're basically back at the beginning of the cycle. Finally, we'll talk about a problem called eutrophication, which results when a body of water receives too much nitrogen and phosphorus. Since these elements are usually so limited, having extra inputs of nitrogen or phosphorus can lead to eutrophication, which literally means excess growth or excess nutrients. This can in turn lead to an algae growth or an algae bloom that covers up the surface of the water. These nitrogen inputs can often come from things like synthetic fertilizers that are applied to lawns or agricultural fields, or when a body of water becomes contaminated with waste from homes or waste from animals, because this waste is an organic compound and they often contain both phosphorus and nitrogen. Now that the surface of the water is covered by these algae that blocks the sunlight from reaching the plants below the surface of the water, those plants die. The algae themselves eventually die off, and then the bacteria in the water use up oxygen to break down the algae and the other dead plants. The reason that they use up the oxygen is because decomposition is an aerobic process, so it requires them to use oxygen. This loss of oxygen as the bacteria use it up results in the death of other aquatic species, especially larger fish species that have high oxygen requirements. Then the bacteria break down those dead organisms, and that uses up even more oxygen. So pretty quickly we have something called a positive feedback loop. A positive feedback loop is where the outcome of the process drives the process to continue forward at an even faster rate. As we have less oxygen, we have more organisms die, which results in more bacteria breaking down those dead bodies, using up even more oxygen, and you can see how this quickly spirals out of control to create something called a dead zone, where the water contains such little oxygen that virtually no life can be supported there anymore. Our practice FRQ for Topic 1.6 will involve the skill of using a visual model to explain relationships between different characteristics of an environmental concept. So I want you to look at this model and choose two reservoirs that are shown in the model, and then I want you to describe how phosphorus moves between those two reservoirs. As always, scan your notes using CAM Scanner and submit them to Canvas to be graded. I am giving 1 point extra credit on every assignment that is turned in using CAM Scanner.